Hello everyone, and welcome to Unpacking the Japanese Game Industry, Part 2, featuring me, the guy who runs this channel, a random dude on the internet who happens to work in the Japanese game industry. You know, I would open the window and show you guys proof that I actually do live here in Japan, but at the same time we do live in a world where people such as Rainbow Overwatch and GeoGuessr exist, so even something as simple as showing you guys the skyline might be enough to get me doxxed, so let's not do that. But yeah, as someone who has worked in the industry for a long time, with this set of videos, I kind of wanted to, in a way, hopefully give people a better understanding of the state that the Japanese game industry is in, and how this is affected by all the things that happen within the industry as well. For those of you for whom this is the first video that you're seeing on this channel, how do you do that? For the rest of you, welcome back. This is the second video in the series, as I mentioned, so we're going to go a lot deeper into the things that were brought up in the first video. In the first video, we covered many of the features of the Japanese game industry, how it is like, how the pay is like, how the actual work conditions and all of that, and how the culture actually is like as compared to many of the stereotypes online. And today, in this second video, what we're going to do is, basing off all of what we have mentioned in the first video, we're going to look at how all of those features actually affect the way that the Japanese game industry is today, and how the Japanese game industry performs as well as goes about content creation as a result. So some things may make a little less sense. I'll try my best. For those of you who have not seen the first video, or considering the fact that it has been a few months, many of us may have forgotten. I probably have forgotten as well, and I made the video, so I'll try my best to give some level of a reminder of the points where necessary, while we go through all of the different features that were brought up within the first episode. But if you want a more detailed look at what was talked about within that first video, you can feel free to go and watch that first, and if you find that interesting, then feel free to come back, since it would make a lot more sense continuity wise. What? You'd think that I would be able to speak English better at this point after all this time has passed, but sometimes it just it just do slip the tongue once in a while nonetheless. And today I would like to share with you guys a quick story. Don't click off just yet, it's a very quick one, I promise. Like, I know most of the videos I say are quick end up being like 30 to 40 minutes long, but I promise this one is quick, okay? So like, initially when I first entered the game industry, full of hope in my eyes, the little glitter, with like, yeah, I'm gonna become a good contributor to making great games. And I joined Koei Tecmo many years back. I actually had a very kind and helpful senior, a senpai if you will. He taught me a lot about game design, everything from the basics such as how to write a good GDD and stuff like that, all the way down the line to stuff such as level design, game balance, long-term economy, as well as character design, game balancing for live ops games as well. And it was a large factor in why I started to find a lot of interest in doing stuff like that, because through the ways that you play with the numbers, you can then set up challenges and in a way interact directly with the players. And that got me a lot of interest in that side of game design as well. Unfortunately, both him and I, we didn't really wear suits to work. This is what you usually only wear on a interview or the like, because it's just not as common in the game industry, but that's besides the point. He also used to moonlight as a bartender, which is not supposed to be something you're doing when you're working in a company. Like, there were rules against it, but no one really stopped him even though it was an open secret, so it's like a whatever. And the thing is that sometimes after work, he would also just set up mini drinking sessions with the rest of the employees within the office itself, but he would actually just like make the drinks on the spot, and we would just sit there and drink and complain about our bosses who was sitting just a little bit away, hoping they wouldn't hear us. And it's during one of those sessions when we were complaining about work and talking about how you really do get a very big variety of people working in the industry, where he actually brought up a point that actually just stuck in my head all the way till this day. It was in the middle of that conversation where he said, yeah, but you have to be a pretty weird person to want to work in the game industry to begin with, let alone the Japanese game industry. And at the time, I didn't really think too much about it. I thought it was just one of those like, true sort of moments. But looking back and thinking about it all these years, he does kind of bring up a very good point. For one thing, even globally, people do tend to say that you tend to really have a very strange sort that tend to want to enter the industry in the first place, since the job isn't exactly easy. Even in many other countries in the West as well, the hours tend to be slightly longer. Crunch is a thing that people, while most companies say they don't do anymore, it's something that had plagued the industry for a very long time. In the working conditions, when compared to just like trying to get a more normie-ish. I feel like that's a very weird word to use. But compared to just aiming for one of those normal business office jobs, it certainly does seem to be one of those occupations where the work does tend to be a little tougher and the conditions just tend to also be not as good. And there's also that second point that he brought up, especially in Japan, that has had me wondering over all these years. Is it really that much worse? And whether or not Japan, with its very unique work culture, as well as its difference in values, will cause it to have a very different impact on the game industry in the country, and whether this would impact it actually for the better or worse overall. And it's through this video that I plan to, in a way, explore deeper into these points, discussing whether all of the points we brought up in the previous video about Japanese work culture, as well as that of the game industry here, would end up actually impacting it for the better or for the worse. Do we play an intro? I don't know if we have an intro. I'm asking you. Oh shit. We'll talk about that later. Anyway, so the first point we'll be going into is how the ease of access, something that I mentioned in the first video, in terms of how easy it is for people to be able to join the Japanese game industry, is something that affects the game industry in many ways that causes it to be slightly different perhaps from the ones that you do see overseas. And what I mean by this is that unless you are talking about a very, very specialized indie setting, with many of the game companies in Japan, just like with many of the regular companies within Japan, many of them are actually quite fine with actually hiring people with zero experience and actually training them up from scratch. Meaning that even if you were someone who has never made a game in your life, not even a shitty little Flash game, or even if you wanted to become a programmer but had zero programming knowledge, there are many companies that would be willing to pick up people with what they believe to be the right attitude and be willing to train up these people to be able to fulfill this role. Right here, as you can see, is an example from this year's Koei Tecmo hiring as well. As you can see from this line here, which is unfortunately in Moon Runes, which most people would complain to me.
Bruh, that's not something we can read.
Like, my apologies. Like, my brain doesn't connect the dot, or it did not connect the dot initially when saying the line. Sometimes it's a little slow up there. But that aside, this line basically is stating that you can actually get a programming position within these companies. Even with zero programming experience, they'd be more than welcome to hire in people. There was the same thing with Sting as well. Sting is a company that made games such as Riviera, The Promised Land, and Yikjo Union, and a company that I interviewed last year. And with that company as well, many of the design side people, basically your level designers and the like, are all fresh graduates with zero game dev experience who want to join the game industry as well, because it is tougher for them to find super experienced people. And as a result, it's easier for them to just hire in these people and try to train them up as well. This links a lot to the generalist mentality of hiring that Japan has had for a very long time now. The idea that if you can bring in someone with the right attitude, you can refine them like your 1,000-folded wheat blades into the super weapon thing person that will be able to fulfill the jobs that you want them to do. And it's also because of this that if you were to join, like, let's say a bank, for example, in a backroom position, they might actually still get you to rotate through multiple positions all across the bank as well. Maybe get you to work the register, is it called register? The desk at the bank as well, to understand how the front line is like before putting you back in the back end. There's a lot of stuff like this that does go on, and it's all part of them wanting people to understand even broader what the company does, and in doing so, hopefully train people who then in the future, due to the understanding of everything, be able to do anything if there is a necessity to. And the thing is, I'm not here to say that this is a horrible system or a bad system overall, because this is a system that obviously has both its good and bad. Because on the one hand, the game industry itself, and many of the people who do make successful indie titles now, many of them do enter, like they start off with very little experience. These people who have played games for a long time, they really loved it and decided to try to make one of these games for themselves. And so you do see that from the start, from the way that this industry in its entirety has been built up from the ground, there have been many a times where people with barely any experience at the time when they began their journey into it slowly managed to find their way and eventually made something pretty good. And so in a way, this style of hiring harkens back to that older day of your more indie styles of development when Koei Tecmo was basically just the president of the company, coding in his little car garage while his wife just sat there and draw the art for the game. As a result of all of this, you do get many interesting perspectives from all the people from the different walks of life entering the industry and entering the bigger companies as well, thereby allowing them to give these companies a certain level of input as well as a certain level of inspiration that otherwise may not have necessarily existed in the company if they were constantly hiring people who were entering this company because of a specific vision that they have already seen in the company and that they have worked towards in the things that they've been studying in terms of game development over the years. And in a way, this chaos, a lot like the chaos that you see walking through the streets of Japan and all of the different weirdly contrasting building designs, actually helps the game industry in a way, due to the fact that the constant need to educate new people and bring in people who may not understand very well how game design even works in the first place into the company sets the people at the higher management as well as the existing dev team to be more conscious of this and to develop things in a way that will allow people with lesser experience to be able to still contribute and understand the project fairly well. And this is especially the case for mobile game live ops. Typically what happens is that a company will prefer, with many of these live ops titles, to put in first relatively fresh people, let them gain experience over the years in that title, and then take them out and then put them into a development of a new title in the end. And so aside from the employees who really want to stay with the project, there is a constant churn of employees every few years as new people are brought in and the more veteran members are shifted to something else. And so there is an even more pressing need to be able to have structures in place that will allow these new people to learn well. And in many of the titles I worked on in the past as well, this was also the case. Like, you really had titles where they basically had the full-on documentation of the game's balance theories, explaining why things are designed and planned the way they are, and how much further these things are expected to be able to creep in the future, and what things to prioritize while creeping, because these are the things that players look out for. Like, you can really go into a very long document, go into everything like this for every single faculty of the game, be it like level design, the character planning. While a game would typically have their own internal artists as well, typically most of the art is actually outsourced to external designers. You see this with many titles now, such as Azure Lane, Blue Archive, and the like. It's basically them getting many of the popular artists on Twitter to do some of the art and contracting it to the same few people to ensure it stays consistent. And typically, the smaller number of core artists they have in the team are either there to just look through and make sure everything is consistent, or to also do some level of the art. But typically, the people within the team would have some level of a art design document to ensure that they will be able to keep track of what is the styles that the game is trying to go with based off of its target audience, and therefore what needs to be focused on within the art in order to target the groups of people that the game wants to have playing the game. And I don't know, maybe there are people out there who might think that having all of this like gameplay features and the like, all of the planning be something that can be streamlined and turned into a system to be kind of messed up. But at the same time, it does also provide these companies with the ability to continue producing content, even if in the worst possible case something happens to many of the core team members. Basically the whole like buzz factor. It basically makes the number as big as possible, thereby ensuring that the project is able to continue, and in a way to ensure that people can continue to get the enjoyment out of the game, even if the people within the team for some inexplicable reason are no longer able to work on the game anymore. However, at a corporate level, when we're talking about the medium to big size companies that already have a certain level of establishment, you know, kind of like your Ubisofts of Japan, like your Koei Tecmos, or your SNKs or Falcoms, or even your bigger companies like your Square Enix, all of them at this point, after all these years, have gotten to a pretty sizable, well, size. That probably was a better way to make that sound cool. Unfortunately, I'm not epic enough of a gamer to be able to do that, my apologies. But it is true that for many of these big companies which have gotten to the point where you probably have more people working on the out of game stuff, like your marketing, your branding, all of that, than the people who are actually working on new development titles at this point. For those kind of companies, there is some level of specialization that arguably is already needed, because when you have that many people who are riding on the success of, well, I mean, that makes it sound a little bad, but a lot of people who are reliant on the success of a very small group of developers, it also means that these people do not have as much of a luxury to be able to make mistakes, which is something that, especially with a fresh person, you're gonna probably see quite a lot of. Or at the very least, even if they tend to not make mistakes, they will tend to be slower at producing stuff. And that is also going to affect these companies a lot more, simply due to the fact that they have a lot more people that they also have to support through the development of their titles. That and the standards of like people who play games in general are a lot higher nowadays than many years in the past. You know, all of the console games that I played on this channel up till now, like many of these games, people even, I mean, they did think it was shit even back in the day, but when you compare that to the games that are made today, you will notice that games in general, there has been a rise in the standards of like what is even considerable a console game, even due to the fact that due to all of the improvements, if people understanding better what works and doesn't work, with the better tools that exist that make certain things easier, games just don't tend to be as bad as they were in the past. And so there is also a level of expectations that people who play games would have, that they would expect people who are making games would actually implement. And when it comes to people who are very fresh in the industry, some of these things, they may not notice it as quickly as people who have been making games or who have been studying the whole like making of games for years before entering a game company as well. And while it might be easy to just like say that, oh, but when you look at many of the indie titles out there, they managed to succeed even with a team that may not have had very much experience, right? Kenshi was a game made by a guy who was initially a security guard making the game on his downtime after work. But we have to remember and be realistic about the fact that with many of these titles, while the initial team may have been the case, it's also true that they do pick up a lot along the way, and many of the people that they do hire into the team to help support the project as it gets bigger tend to be people who do have that experience anyways. Like, you really have to understand the risk that these people are going through in the production of these titles. Like, you look at Cuphead as well. The devs actually quit their job and mortgage their home just to fund production of the game. If, frankly, along the way as they develop the game, they were to hire more and more people who had no idea how to develop the game, frankly, they wouldn't really have had enough money to train these people while also developing the game at the same time. And even for the Kenshi dev as well, while he did manage to build a team in the end, he initially started out and had to fund most of his game's production while working as a security guard during the night shift. And it was after a while where he finally get enough money, both through the early access of the game as well, that he managed to actually get on more programmers onto the team to help with the project's development. And so it's not like they're just hiring a bunch of people who also have no experience in training them all up from the ground. Rather, it's built up of people who have gained experience over working on the title and realize what they can and can't do, and are hiring in people with experience to fill the parts that they themselves can't accomplish. Though that's not to say, of course, that there is no space for all of these new people who are fresh and who want to enter the industry without much of experience. There are still plenty of ways that this can work. And of course, the thing with that is that it requires very specific conditions within the company that can be met to ensure that these people can have the proper environment to grow and improve in. And so over here I have a list of things that I feel it is very important for a company to have if they want to be able to train people who have zero experience in game design to some level of competency in being able to contribute or even become big game developers themselves in the future. One, and I feel like this goes without saying, you're going to want to have people who can teach really well, right? You want people who within your own company, especially veterans, who can, using all of the experience they have making successful titles, teach these new people coming into the company what is important to look out for and all of the best practices so that they can get their work done in the smoothest way possible. You don't want Tom Johnson McGufferson, the guy who has like a PhD in durdling himself to like be teaching your new employees how to develop games if he himself does not have that level of experience. You're just gonna have a bunch of people who just end up being like monkeys sitting around just jacking themselves off instead. Next up, you're gonna want to have the time and the ability to teach people in a relatively safe environment. I say relatively safe because let's be frank, no company ever is gonna put these people into a 2-year design course or like Baba's first little nursery game design course and just train them for 2 years and have them do nothing else. You typically want people who can contribute to the fact that you're bleeding money every single year, paying for all of the different wages for all of the people, including these new people themselves. But either way, you're going to want to put them into a fairly safe-ish environment where even if they make mistakes, it won't cost the company millions of dollars because you don't want to put them directly into the fire with zero experience, or you're going to end up with something like Gundam Evolutions instead. It goes without saying that you're going to want to have the money to be able to fund all of these programs as well, because frankly, if you can't afford it, then you really shouldn't be hiring people who you're gonna need to spend time teaching before you can put them into your team as any level of a contributing factor towards the project's success. And lastly, you're gonna want to have the benefits that can retain these people in the long term. There ain't no point in training people only to have them leave the company the moment they're done with the training because they realize that your company is so dog shit that they may as well only just stay so that they can get the experience and leave. And I feel like in Japan, many game companies do have this problem to some extent. It's like how many people who join Cygames also tend to leave within 3 years because of the fact that the company is structured such that only 10% of the people within the company are full-time workers and only 20% are contract workers, and the remaining 70% are people who work in a sort of like Uber gig economy within the company itself. We'll get into that maybe in a future video if there's any reason to, but suffice to say, if you're working in a company in that 70% with fewer benefits than a full-time employee, maybe you only just want to work until you get enough experience that every other company out there will want to hire you. And so it is very important as a company that you have enough benefits or that you provide enough of a reason for the people that you're hiring to train up to stay in the company for the long term, so that after you train them up, you can then put them to work developing things that would then contribute back to the company. And so all this is basically to say that typically the companies that you would expect to be running such programs would tend to be the ones that are both pretty big in size and that tend to have pretty deep pockets. Yeah, sorry, I don't really have enough money to be flicking around a stack of cash here looking cool, so we just got a single note here, but just pay that no mind. Something like Square Enix, Bandai Namco, Koei, which actually does do this, and companies like this. But then this brings us to the deeper underlying problem that many of these big companies also do happen to face, and why it makes these companies less able to train the people that arguably they as game studios should be able to do. So needless to say, all the points I'm about to bring out, they don't necessarily apply to all of the AAA, AA companies I'm going to be talking about now, but many of them do have at least one or two of these, and many of these points do tend to hinder the company's ability to therefore train people, even in spite of the fact that these are the big companies that should. And because of the Japanese culture and way of hiring here, are actually hiring people with zero experience. For example, with point number one, people who can teach very well. Well, the issue with this is the fact that many of the AAA companies within Japan, they tend to actually outsource quite a fair bit of the production of the title itself, especially at the grounds development level, to other companies instead. Companies such as Flame Hearts, Gem Drops, Biking, you've probably seen some in the previous videos as well. The thing with many of these big companies is that they tend to have like a very small core of veterans who are working on very specific projects, typically the ones that have brought the company to this level of fame. But then when it comes to every project that isn't those projects, they typically just tend to have someone at a producer level or at maybe director levels as well, just basically the people at the top, while basically not being involved in the development of the title itself. And we see this a lot with companies such as Bandai Namco, for example, where the majority of the titles that they do release, even under their own name, tend to be released and produced with the assistance of some other company. I mean, yeah, they do have the teams that develop some of their biggest titles still working there. Like, you do see many of the vets that help to build up something like Final Fantasy. The producer for Final Fantasy itself they're all still there. With Bandai Namco, you do see that most of the Tales games are also still made in-house, but you do see that more often than not, the bigger majority of the titles that aren't their mainstay titles are all produced either completely by or with the assistance of external parties. And this in part because of the fact that a large part of these big AAA game companies in Japan now are quite lacking the actual competencies due to the fact of that they hire the types of people that they do, and they do not really have the people to train these people up, that they just do not have that level of competency or capability to develop games at the same level that they do with the bigger IPs that they do have. And the thing with the people in the big teams is that they then don't really have the time to be going around teaching these people, because they need these people to basically produce the big titles that are keeping the company alive. And of course, there's no shame in like working with other companies to produce a title. Obviously, it's tough at times to find the competencies within your own company if you're trying to create something wholly new, which maybe the company has never tried before and they want to break out in something new. And so you get help and assistance from people who might have some better understanding of those genres than you do. Yeah, that's fine, right? We all are humans. Me especially, I'm a very weak human. So we do have things that we're not as good at. So it's important for game companies to sometimes collaborate to produce a better title. But what I'm trying to say with all of this is not so much the fact that assistance bad or something like that. It's more that the amount of assistance that they're actually getting for the production of many of the titles is also a hint of the fact that they really do not have that many teams that are super competent or talented that are able to produce all of the big wins that they would probably need to keep the company alive, which also basically means that it would be tough for these big companies to actually even find the time to train up these new people to work on all of these new titles. And this also brings us to the second point within this first point, which is that many of these companies also do, due to their size, have a lot of issues with siloing. And what I mean by this is basically the fact that between the many brands that exist within the company, you do see some level of them being funneled into their own teams, and the people are then really able to communicate with people from the other teams. And this happened a lot when I was working in Koei Tecmo as well. You really didn't have much communication going on between the people at Gus, the people at Shibusawa Co, and the people at Team Ninja. You just kind of had an inkling and understanding of what they did, and unless you managed to, on your own time, somehow find a way to reach out to and get to know the people in those teams better, very rarely would you ever get a chance to interact with them. And more often than not, the brands don't really communicate and interact with each other. Like, you don't really have things like cooperation or the sharing of technologies between each other. Typically, it's the top management that has to convince them to do this as well. Which is why, even though, like with these big companies, they may have 1 or 2 or maybe even 3 or more very talented teams, it's not necessarily the case that because they have these talented teams, therefore the rest of the company is also going to be talented, because more often than not, they don't really have the opportunity to get these people to teach the rest of the new people they're hiring with zero experience within the company. And lastly, there's also the issue of the ease of access working both ways. As I mentioned in the previous video, changing jobs within the game industry while changing every 2 to 3 years is still frowned upon. The idea of changing jobs every now and then is something that is more widely accepted within this industry, even in Japan. And you do see that many of the people from these formerly big companies tend to just move on to other companies or just end up setting up their own companies instead. Sunshow Studios, set up by former Capcom members. Flame Hearts, the company I mentioned before that does more outsourced work, largely hiring and poaching from like the vets that are in companies like Capcom and Konami as well. The fact of the matter is that if you're moving every 5 to 10 years, the industry in Japan, for when it comes to games at least, is a lot more forgiving compared to most of the other industries within this country, with people constantly shifting around. And as a result, if these companies do not treat their veterans well, like in this many cases, they'll just leave and they'll find their own ways to produce games that they want. And with that, they also therefore bring with them all of the knowledge and expertise that they have, which also means that there are fewer people left within these companies who can continue to teach the new members who then come in, right? Because if you can't depend on the people working on the big successful titles to do it, then you would want to depend on the rest of the vets that you cultivated over the years. But if because of the lack of benefits or the lack of creative space within the company, these vets then choose to leave as well, then you really do end up in a situation where there aren't many people left who can teach all of this new unexperienced people brought in. And when it comes to the second and third point, basically being able to have the cushion required to pick up and train all of this people who are very fresh to the industry, the fact of the matter is many of these AAA, AA companies just do not have that luxury anymore. You look at many of the big companies out there, Square Enix has not been doing well for a long time. The original Final Fantasy VII remake that came out in 2020, that got about 700,000 sales in Japan, which sounds like a really good number until you realize that the original Final Fantasy VII actually sold 2 million copies within 3 days as compared to the remake's entire first week. And when you look at many of their more recent titles as well, the head of the company himself has come out and actually said that FF16 as well as Rebirth for FF7, they both did not manage to meet the targets that they had hoped to hit with them, in spite of the fact that the sales were actually pretty good for both of these titles. And when you look at Bandai Namco, you can see the same thing happening as well, where within this year they actually had this fairly massive stock drop, for those of you who remember, in part because of the fact that they announced that they had to basically reduce their projected earnings due to the fact that they realized that most of that was just unrealistic at this point, and they had to cut many of their in-development titles simply because they realized that they couldn't go ahead with just constantly churning out more titles as they have always been. And the reason for this is very much the same as every other AAA, AA company in the rest of the world. They have gotten very big off with the success from their older IPs, and they've reached a point where the company is simply so bloated with people on the business side as well. And due to the fact that they are also a publicly traded company, it also means that they have a lot of expectations that they have to meet and a much higher hurdle that they have to achieve in order to be able to be successful. Which puts these companies in a very difficult position when it comes to their whole desire to hire people with no experience and train them up, due to the fact that due to the huge amount of expectations that the company has on its shoulders, there are multiple conflicting things that they have to do. One of which is that they would want to ensure that, like what many companies are doing now, they focus more on the titles that have made them successful till now and ensure that those are of a high quality. So basically things like what Square Enix and Bandai have mentioned of, they're gonna focus more on their big titles, like Tekken, for example, for Bandai and stuff like that, Final Fantasy for Square Enix. The issue with doing that is that it's a lot more difficult to basically train new people in such a situation, due to the fact that you kind of want this project to succeed, and therefore you kind of want to minimize the risk that could be created with these massive titles by putting people with no experience in it. And if you do put them in, it is also true that simultaneously there is less for them to learn, because of the fact that for many of these big IPs, many things are already established and are things that they may not be able to change themselves. And so the amount of things that they can actually get onto and doing within a big IP might actually be a lot less than one might actually expect. Because there is a very big difference in working on a new title from scratch and trying to figure out everything that you need on the way there to get to your end goal, as compared to working with a team that is already established, with a big title under its belt. In a way, it is a safe environment because of the fact that you have all the big veterans working on these projects, but it's also an environment where there's a lot less for them to learn, due to the fact that there isn't as much new things that need to be introduced, and even if they are, these people are less likely to be involved with those as well. And next is the development of new titles, arguably kind of where you want these people to be. Right, you want them to maybe join your company, be put together in a team with some people who are experienced, and maybe release some lower risk titles that are smaller in nature, and therefore even if it takes some level of a hit, it is still something that the company can afford to take the hit for. But the issue that we have reached at this point is the fact that many of these companies aren't able to work on these titles to this extent anymore. Like you have many of these companies, even Square Enix, for example, has cut some of its in development mid to smaller scale titles, and have started to cut off many of their live ops mobile games as well, even those that were doing fairly well-ish, such as Sinnoh Alice, which if I recall was actually within the top 100 in terms of this style of what Japan would call social games at the time, if I'm not mistaken. And even if these companies are gonna put people into these teams, by virtue of the fact that they're probably only gonna start working on big massive titles now, if it means that there is a reasonable level of success, they're probably going to do what many of the companies that I worked in did as well. And they're going to put the veterans in as well and prioritize those people instead of the newer staff members with little experience, which basically means that in a company where there is now a situation where you can't really use your massive IPs as a way to train or teach your new employees all that much, and you simultaneously also can't allow these people to work on the lower risk new IPs, as there's a change in mindset where most of these companies want to only focus on releasing massive new IPs if they can ensure that it's of some level of scale and quality. Then there just isn't really a way for these companies to train these people well anymore. And when it comes to the last point on having good benefits that can retain people, I feel like this is just something that in the Japanese game industry in general, it's just fairly lacking. You look at something like side games, for example, the only reason people stay for long is because they either like how the very weird contractual structure of the company allows them to basically work like a gig economy personnel, and therefore they don't give a fuck that their pay goes down if it means that they can slack off. Or the people for whom the benefit is basically being able to become a potential full-time employee in the future. So when you look at situations like that, you kind of realize that the company doesn't really have any massive benefits going for it. If you're within the 70%, your health insurance, which typically is settled by the company if you work in Japan, will not be settled by side games. You're going to have to do your taxes on your own as well. All of these simple benefits that typically would be assisted by with the company you work in will just not be provided as a result. Then you also have stuff like the weird part-time jobs I mentioned in the previous video, where you're basically doing the entire work that a full-timer does, except that you don't get any of the benefits of being an employee of the company. Not a contract worker, mind you, an actual like part-timer is what they call the position. So you don't even get days of leave. Like stuff like that still exists to some extent, and that's very shady. Internships don't actually really help either, as they basically are not being used in the same way that overseas internships are, where you actually enter the company, work on lighter roles while the company teaches you how things work in the company, so that you actually grow and learn and understand how to work in a workplace setting, and then they can hire you in the future. With Japan, it's a lot more the case that you just get treated as like free labor or something. You work with the company for maybe a week, even like as short and insane as it sounds, yeah, a week or maybe a month, where you basically do the same job as a full-timer, and then it ends. You may not even get hired by the company. There's a lot more of that. And that makes the whole concept of what people overseas consider an internship very foreign within Japan. And also part of the reason why the youth or the next generation isn't getting as well like educated or prepped up to speed to work within the industry itself, even when they get internships within it. As you can imagine, that also then goes along to causing the issue of many people entering companies with no experience and having to learn up from scratch for there, thereby slowing down the process of educating these people, as well as there's so many more things that they need to learn to be able to then contribute to the company. And it's not just for people in this weird sort of contractual styles as well. Many of the companies, the things that are considered to be like big benefits according to them are things that either are just not really something that people can even make use of, kind of like with Sting when I went there and they were talking about how they had flex time, but at the same time when you look at the people who talked about the company within it who were like giving comments about it as well, you kind of realize that you had a company where yeah, you had flex time, but you were pretty much guaranteed to not be able to use it simply because the conditions, the number of people and the type of people working there were not sufficient to ensure that the project could be completed in a reasonable amount of time, and therefore that your flex time could then be used. Hybrid work from home, that is also very rare at this point still. Many companies still believe in the whole, we need people every day in the company to like sit together and talk because that's the fastest way to operate, which in this day and age, especially with a country as big as, I mean, it's not that big compared to like America or something, but with a country where traveling from one major city to the other takes at least 3 hours by the Shinkansen, and companies basically have people working across both, it kind of makes it feel a little silly that they actually need people in the office to talk to people online in the other city, which is what happened to me in many of the companies I worked in the past, you always had them saying, "Oh, we must get the people working in the company, in the office together." And then I'll go to the office, sit down, turn on the PC and enter a digital meeting with the entire team, half of whom are just in the other part of the country. So yeah, there's just a lot of that very traditional mindset that is still there, in spite of the fact that logically, when you think about how things are going, it just doesn't make sense as much. You still have companies who treat Saturday as a work day rather than as a full day off, because of the fact that legally, by law, it's the case that you can have people work a office job 6 out of 7 days a week, so they just count Saturday as a work day instead, and therefore they skimp out on paying you to some extent. And sick leaves don't exist at all in this country. If you ever fall sick, you're gonna need to use your own paid leave to basically take the sick day off, unless you work in a weird company like the one I work in now, where they just turn a blind eye and just tell you to like rest at home, and they don't ask you to use the leave. But even then, I don't get sick leave either. It's more on the company's good grace. And the list could just go on with all of the issues in terms of benefits that companies provide to retain their staff. And so it is very difficult for many of this, especially the big companies who have a more traditional upper management, to maintain their veterans, as many of them would either just leave to form their own companies where they can make life better for themselves and for others, or they'll just go to the newer companies which are more modernized in this kind of situations. As a result of the 4 points not being met, especially in the bigger companies, what you do tend to see is that many of these companies do tend to churn through their employees quite a fair bit, due to the fact that they simply cannot provide the environment required for these people to learn and develop well, and due to the fact that they're not able to retain the people who could teach these people who are entering the company newly well, due to the fact that their benefits by virtue of the company being more traditional, especially in its upper management, just tend to not be as good as compared to the newer companies set up by these veterans themselves, or that in order to be more competitive, try to provide these benefits that tend to pull these people away from the larger firms. This leaves these companies in a situation where there just simply aren't many people left who can teach well, and many of the people who do enter the company and who end up working on the longer standing life ops or the long spanning titles with a more established framework, they tend to become very specialized, almost too specialized in a way, where a lot of the knowledge that they gain simply is just not transferable to another game, because it only works within the specific rule set of how this game's systems are designed. This can then come back to harm the employees who, due to the fact that they're not able to exceed expectations in these other projects when they're shifted out, also means that their bonuses, their pay raise is all gonna be worse off as well. And it also means that when these people are put into something completely foreign, their amount of hours that they'll have to work overtime is probably also going to increase, as they're likely to struggle to try and get the work completed, due to the fact that they just simply are put into situations where they are out of their depth. And this might also then contribute to why you really do not see many people wanting to join the game industry in Japan, especially in the end, because of the fact that if you really wanted to pursue like prospects and like a successful career that earns you a ton of money, there are certainly many other better ways to go about it than trying to join the game industry instead. Notice how even when we're talking about just this one single point till now, many different parts of Japanese work culture do tend to be brought up in all of this, and this is because a large part of what makes the industry better or worse in its respective ways is all very intertwined with how the culture of hiring people here just differs quite a fair bit from many countries overseas as well. And this brings us to the next segment of the video, which is on how the work conditions as well as its image end up affecting the Japanese game industry as well. So needless to say, most of the people out there, I'm sure most of you watching the video as well, already have a preconception of how the Japanese work culture is like. And many of these things are also pushed out there by many people, especially Japanese people, who talk about their experiences as well as the experiences of the people around them. The fact of the matter with the Japanese game industry, and this is something I brought up in the previous video as well, alongside some of the national data and statistics that exist with regards to the work culture as well in Japan. Across many industries nowadays, the amount of work hours over time that people are working has slowly started to reduce. And another thing we brought up in the video is also the fact that the Japanese game industry does seem to have a higher level of average wage than the other industries do, at the expense of having almost double the amount of overtime hours that others do. The issue with this is whether or not the additional pay a person gets as their base salary besides overtime is enough as is to basically encourage people to join in spite of the fact that the number of overtime hours are doubled, which basically means that you're working about an additional 12 hours of overtime a month, up to about 25 on average in the game industry. And thus the issue arises of whether or not the additional amount that the person is paid per month is enough to incentivize people to join in spite of the fact that the number of overtime hours are doubled. And yeah, one important thing to realize is that with many companies now, your overtime hours are already factored into your base pay for many industries out there. The game industry does this. Depending on the company you work for, 20 to 40 hours of your overtime might already be incorporated into the pay that you're given every month. So as you can imagine, this might disincentivize people from joining the game industry in the first place, simply due to the fact that it's not like you're getting that much more from your additional hours of overtime since you're being already paid the more or less full amount flat. And the monthly pay itself, the increase depending on who you ask, it may not seem like a lot to warrant wanting to work the additional 13 hours. Different people, they might have different priorities in life. Some people might prefer to get the free time rather than to work more hours of overtime for a minuscule amount of increase in pay. So for some people, they might rather just go to another industry, because even if they don't get the national average, if they get something slightly above that, the discrepancy with the Japanese game industry isn't massive enough for some people to want to warrant getting the additional hours of work that they have to deal with each month. And so as you can imagine, this can cause many people to turn away from the game industry in the end due to the fact that they're having to put in a lot more hours for arguably not that much more gains, because even if the project were to blow up, the employees within the team, typically their bonuses are fixed to some very small percentage of the overall performance. So unless the title is something like a Final Fantasy VII, you're probably not going to get that much out of it either. As according to data provided by one of the bigger recruitment firms working with many of these game companies, it would seem that the average attrition rate within the industry is actually higher than the national average. So it does seem like many people are indeed leaving the industry, and this will then cause a spiral for everyone else still within the company, as this is also going to mean that they're going to have to work more to cover for these people. And adding on top of this is that precisely because the industry has this kind of impression going for it, fewer people are then willing to join the industry, and as a result, you tend to see fewer and fewer people working towards trying to join it. And a lot like with the bad impression that work-life balance in Japan has overall, because of the bad impression that this industry has given over the years, even now when many of the companies are trying to clean up their act, it is still a fact that many people still have a bad impression of the industry because of all the stereotypes that exist. And many people who have bad experiences with this are then going to go on to advocate against it, which is then, going to cause this to spiral even more, even as companies are trying to improve it. So yeah, while many companies within the industry are trying to clean up their act and trying to make things better for everyone overall, it is still a fact that the work conditions overall still leave a lot of room for improvement. And it is precisely because of the state that it's still currently in, and the bad impression that people have of the industry because of all the things that used to happen in the past. Like there was a period of time for me as well where I used to work like 12-hour work weeks because of the fact that things just didn't get so busy at times, that it causes people to be less willing to join. And this makes it harder for companies to then get good talent. And this also means that the current talent tend to be worked even harder, which might cause them to then burn out and leave the industry as well instead, causing a level of a brain drain as well. And this is further exacerbated by what I'd call the job over security that Japan has as well. And what I mean by this is the fact that within Japan, it is very rare for companies to fire people. Typically, you would only get fired if you did something pretty bad, like sexual harassment, for example. But incompetence or not performing super well in and of itself is not something that a company would typically fire someone over. And many employers go out of their way to actively try to keep people in the company as well. A large part of this is because to the company, to fire someone is in a way a loss of face, which is a tradition that's been around in Japan for quite a while, where if they were to fire someone or to let them go even, it basically implies that the company did a bad job in their original decision process of hiring the person in the first place. And that in a country where for the longest of time, employing and keeping someone employed for their entire life was a thing, it meant that the company would look super bad, or at least they thought they would. And as a result, people tend to be able to stay in a single job their entire life. And the thing with this is that rather than actually making people more willing to give their all for the company since they know that they're going to be able to stay there for a long time, it has actually for the longest of times had the opposite effect instead. A recent article put out by the Japan Times actually shows that Japan has one of the lowest levels of active engagement of their workforce with their job. This was at about 6%, which might sound like a number that people may not think too hard about at first, because after all, it's like people really love their job so much, they wouldn't be falling for all those YouTube fraudsters telling them that they can unlock them from the 9 to 5 if you follow my 5 easy steps, including sending me all your money as Bitcoin to a Nigerian prince or something. But the fact of the matter is that a country like the United Kingdom is at about 33% of their workforce being actively engaged, as in willing to go out of their way to give more to their job than just doing the bare minimum. And when you go to countries like Australia and China, it's still 21 and 19% respectively. So Japan being at 6% is really massively low. And a large part of why it is this low is due to the fact that the working conditions have been for the longest of time pretty poor. And even till today, while they have been getting better, I would say myself that they still could be a lot better. Like, there's still a lot of catching up to do to get to where many countries are in the West in terms of like worker protection and actual work-life balance. And it's because of the current conditions, as well as the fact that people can stay in the job and give their bare minimum and not be fired because companies want to keep people around rather than firing them, that it leads to a large proportion of the workforce actually just checking out at work instead, in the very buzzwordy term that the HR across the world really likes to use: quiet quitting. Yeah, just allergic to bullshit like fucking buzzwords is all. My apologies. But yeah, as you can imagine, this is really at odds with the whole generalist hiring mentality, because the whole idea of hiring people with a good attitude and training them up is a lot harder to achieve when the people that you're hiring in are going to lose a large part of their motivation very quickly, and the people who are in the company who you expect to train these people have either left or are probably fairly disengaged with their work as well. And when you consider the fact that within many of the more traditional companies, Japan has had for a very long time had an issue or the belief that you should put people who are fairly senior and who basically are supposed to have a lot more experience in positions of responsibility in guiding the company forward. And so you tend to see that the people who do get put in the producer level positions for many of these companies tend to be at least of a certain level of age and have spent a certain level of years within the company as well. The issue, as you can imagine, ties back to everything that we've spoken about till now. If you don't have the good way to retain your employees, and the veterans who know that they can make it better in the industry if they leave have left, and the people who remain, only maybe 6% of them are actively engaged with their work, that makes for a very small proportion of people who can then actually contribute to the company when you put them in a bigger position later on. And this is something I actually do see a lot of at work as well, wherein like in many of the companies I've worked in the past, you tend to have most of the people within the team or the project just being completely checked out and leaving decision making for the project, for the game going forward to just a very small number of people, and they'll just basically execute without thinking much about whether or not there are issues with the way that this thing is supposed to be executed. Which, especially when it comes to live ops titles, basically your mobile games especially, it makes it very problematic when people aren't actively checking to ensure that there aren't many issues with what they're uploading to the server. Basically, when they're given the specs, they basically just enter it as is, and they don't really bother to look at how or whether or not this is correct. And this can lead to, and is quite likely a part of why, for so many titles out there, you tend to see bugs happening every other update, or with some titles, even every update, every 2 weeks for that matter. The fact on the matter is that it's actually not very difficult with many of these projects to actually check for this type of errors as well, simply due to the fact that more often than not, with many of these mobile games, especially the Japanese ones, most of the data management is done through Excel. Yeah. Like, most of it is just entered into Excel, exported into a CSV, and the CSV is then put into the game with all of the data that's required. So it's not like the data is very difficult to check. It's just more a case of people aren't actively engaged enough with the job to want to do a good job to ensure that everything that is going into the game makes sense and is supposed to be the way it is. Like, there's a case that even till this day just stays like rent-free in my mind because of how frustrating it was at the time, wherein the producer of the project basically went on a paternal leave since his wife was giving birth, and they kind of wanted both of the parents to be around to take care of the kid for the first few weeks at least. And during the first week that he had left and was busy with his, family stuff, a bug occurred in the game. And the way to fix the bug actually was very simple. Right? I can't talk about exactly what it was, but it was something that even I, who had only been in the company for about a year, could look at and be like, yeah, just do this instead and it'll be fine. I brought it up to everybody in the team, like the people, like the assistant producer, the people below them, like the director, lead planner, every single person, all of them, the only thing they could say was like, yeah, I don't know, we don't know enough if all of this would work. Like, let's just wait for the producer to come back and let him decide. Like, what the fuck do you mean? You're everybody down from the assistant producer down to the fucking lead planner. No one understands the spec that they're putting into the game enough to be able to say that this simple thing can't be done the way it is. And sure enough, when the producer, they had to call him up because the bug was left in the game for an entire fucking week because no one wanted to make the decision. And after that 1 week, he basically gave the same solution that I gave, and it was it was so frustrating seeing everybody so mentally checked out that nobody understood the game's spec enough to be able to notice the simple solution, and everyone would rather wait and let the issue fester for a week when players could suffer from it just so that they could wait for the producer to make the decision. I feel like I'm getting a little too heated up over that, but the fact of the matter is that as a result of the job over security and the poor work conditions, you do see that people tend to be a lot less motivated to actually give their best for the work, which, I get the idea of work-life balance. You want to ensure that you can get good rest and work well as well, right? You want to ensure that both can be done realistically. But the issue with many of these people, or many of the people within the industry as well, is just the fact that work conditions in the past have been bad for long enough that many of them, they just go to work. Many of these people are seeing game design, game development as too much of a job rather than something that they want to do because of a game that they want to actually produce. And as a result, many of them are in this kind of situation which Japan is in. I can see this as something that people might do, especially in the bigger companies, if anything, such as the AAA, simply due to the fact that it is a lot easier to come in a very specific position, like say localization or marketing, and just to check out at work, simply due to the fact that there are many more people who could pick up the slack. And so even if you choose to just clock out on time every single day and just ignore your overtime, with a big enough company, they probably would be something that you can get away with for earning more. And so I can see it actually being a bigger issue, especially for the larger companies, which might also explain why many of them at times feel so bloated. You look at the Jujutsu Kaisen game, you see more than 100 people working on the title. For a game that kind of ended up the way it did, and you think about how this could have potentially even happened in the first place, and looking at all of these points together, it kind of does paint a picture of how many people might have just been completely disinterested in the work they were doing and were just completely checking out at work, and that caused them to need to put more people onto the project, which increased its cost and also caused many specs that were considerably bad and that shouldn't have gone into the game to have gone in because people weren't motivated enough to try to make a better game. That, and there's also the issue of the hierarchical, hierarchical,
Hierarchical.
hierarchical,
Hierarchical.
hierarchical, the hierarchical, why is English so difficult? The hierarchical nature of the workplace within Japan as well. Now, needless to say, your boss being your boss, and therefore you kind of need to show him some level of respect. It's something that in most countries across the world, people would view as being a given to some extent, right? Since that is the person who holds your performance bonuses, your pay raise, and your getting fired in their hands. So really, it does feel like many of the olds in this country are just completely entitled assholes at this point, in part because of this. But that's another issue completely. Let's just leave that aside for now. There's just so many different things you need to remember, to the extent that even Japanese people themselves, most of them don't actually understand most of this. It is only taught to many of them when they enter a company and the company holds some sort of formal Japanese manner etiquette course. I actually took it as well back then. It's almost insane the levels to which you have this kind of minor etiquette things that you need to take note of, especially when it comes to dealing with clients. Like, I remember some of it still to this day, stuff like how when you enter the elevator, there are specific positions each of you have to stand at, depending on your level of position within the company. When you sit in a meeting room, for example, the seat closest to the door is set by the person of the lowest position, and the person who's of the highest position within the company sits furthest away on the opposite side of the door, and stuff like that. There's a lot of like silly formality things that do exist and that companies still teach, because to some extent it is still necessary, especially when talking to external clients. And as you can imagine, because of this level of formality, it's also very difficult to let people know when they done gone and fucked up. And this is something that many people have talked about in many different forms, such as how when you're talking to your boss, you can't actually like tell him that he's wrong or that his opinion doesn't make sense. Instead, you have to use the equivalent of verbal ninjutsu to basically go around the entire issue and make him seem like the smart guy. Hey boss, I know you said this, but it does feel like that on its own probably wasn't your entire idea, right? You're probably trying to say to do this and then that. Or you maybe like, if you think that the original thing is completely stupid, you can be like, if I'm not mistaken, you were probably trying to say this instead of the original thing, right? Since this does seem like it makes a lot more sense, and it is the thing that you as the person who is like the big boss would probably have been expecting. Maybe it was me who doesn't understand it correctly. Is that what you truly wanted to do? And stuff like that. I think I mentioned in a previous video as well. And the reason why this is an issue is because, and this is something I mentioned in the Jujutsu Kaisen Curse Clash video as well, this level of formality makes it very difficult for companies to operate in a creative space, especially one where, like when you talk about game design that is bottom up, you kind of want people in a room together giving ideas, and then maybe after all the ideas are out to then argue and discuss what works and what doesn't. But with this kind of setting that Japan has, it makes it a lot harder to do that, because many people are very afraid of shooting down ideas that their bosses have given, just simply because of how it might reflect on them within the power structures that Japan has. And it also means that when companies like your big AAA who really love to outsource a large part of their games to other companies to design, actually send it out to have those companies prepare it, it's a lot harder for those companies to then produce something of quality at times, simply due to the fact that it might be very difficult for them to tell the people in the original AAA company, the producers who are there, that the ideas that they want to have in the game kind of either don't make sense or would actually run in contrast to some of the design goals of the game. And as a result, it either leads to systems that shouldn't be in the game being in it, or development being dragged out, because these companies need to find ways to try and let the producers or the management people within the original company know that these things don't work, which sometimes might even go to the extent of actually implementing the thing in the game, showing them that it feels like shit, and then at that point asking them to change it, even though it would have made sense to do it at a much earlier phase within the development. This, as a result, can restrict innovation and cause the quality of games to fall as a result of people not being able to fully speak their minds. So even if people might have good ideas, it might be difficult for them to at times suggest these ideas, because it might run in conflict with their superiors' ideas for the project, or it might make it hard for them to just tell these people that something shouldn't be implemented. And this is also a part of why many games out there sometimes just end up feeling like they're just all over the place. And looking at some of the high-level Kusoges that we're seeing come out of some of the big AAAs as well, it does feel like as the years pass and more people check out, and the people who are actually talented, more and more of them either go somewhere else to ply their trade or start to grow old and retire, we do see that the quality of the content being produced from some of these places has taken a hit as well as a result. Though all of this might sound pretty bad, because it is, it does have the strange benefit or side effect, I guess, of also making it a lot easier for top-down projects to be pushed. And it's also part of the reason why within Japan you do tend to see that you have many more famous star producers or directors as compared to in the West, perhaps, where you have people like Hideo Kojima, Yoko Taro, Harada Katsuhiro. Like you tend to see people like this able to shine and stand out more due to the fact that all of these people have very strong visions of what they want to produce. Even if the workforce itself is rather unmotivated, it is still easy for them to produce a game that is of fairly good quality, simply due to the fact that They just have to tell these people what to do, and because the vision itself is solid enough, these people who feel obliged to give their, well, I mean, their bare minimum at times, but because of the fact that these people at the top know what they want to make and therefore can push these people to work harder in a sense by basically setting the goalposts of what is considered bare minimum for them, they can then ensure that they can produce a game that ends up being fairly successful, even in spite of the lack of motivation or vision that the people below them might have at times. Another example I think would be Puzzles and Dragons, which is a mobile game, which I did work on that project for a while back, where the producer Yamamoto Daisuke was someone who would be extremely pushy with the ways that he would get people to try to implement his vision. Like there were times where he would just come up, because he's the one that comes up with most of the ideas for the game. Sometimes he would just go to the people within the team and be like, hey, I've got an idea for something that is great. We should do this, and I want you guys to help me implement it. So basically get the programmers to code it and then get the designers, the planners to basically flesh it out more so that it would actually work within the game. And then at times people, they'll just be like, yeah, but that seems pretty tough to implement. I don't think we can do it. And he would just be the kind of person who will go like, well, if you ain't gonna do it, I'm gonna do it. And then everyone will basically panic, because if they just let him do everything on his own, it will probably cause something fairly bad to happen, because obviously no one is perfect. No one's going to be able to do every single thing on their own. And so because of the sheer panic that he can put people into from his strong vision and his willingness to push that vision, it can actually get people motivated to work and to ensure that the work gets done. So in a weird, potentially twisted way, it does in a way benefit the industry in a sense, simply just due to the fact that it makes top-down leadership a lot more easy to execute. So in these situations where you do have people who are very capable and willing to push projects at the top, things would pretty much move fairly smoothly and effectively. The issue, of course, there is then just getting the people who are in those positions in the first place, especially as over time the people who were in those positions grow old and the people who are recruited into the company, you know, after everything that we've talked about up till this point, just check out and are just not experienced enough to be able to do something of that caliber. And the next way in which the characteristics of the industry actually affect the way it operates is how many of these things also cause the industry to have a somewhat, I need to think of a word here that won't get me into very big trouble with big companies, but the anti-proliferation ways that the industry operates at times. Some might even say anti-competitive at times, but that's a word that in and of itself, because of the way that the legal definition works, is kind of difficult to use, so we'll just go with anti-proliferation instead. And what I mean by this is that the industry has had, for the longest of times, many ways in which it operates, which kind of restricts the ability for the indie scene to thrive, and for companies to be as innovative as they could potentially be in developing new titles. So the general stance of companies being against any form of content creation that is not officially produced by themselves is something that isn't exactly new to this whole industry. We have seen this over the years with the way that Nintendo treats all of the different forms of fan-made content, be it doujins to even events with the more recent Smash tournament, which at this point is already a few years back, so it's not that recent. But there were also situations such as when Toei actually went on to YouTube and started to copyright strike some of the channels that basically reviewed the works that they produced. And even though it was used in a transformative matter, in English sometimes, manner, it still resulted in the company using its own position to basically push for this content to be removed in the end. And this is one of those situations where I feel like opinions tend to be very polarized, because on the one hand you have people who believe that, you know, fan-made content, it's free promotion for the series and it's a good way for fans to show their love for the series, and therefore it's something that should exist. But you also have the other camp of people who are like, no, this is the company's IP, they deserve to be able to do whatever they want with it, and like screw off whoever they feel should not be using their content in whatever way that they do not want them to. And the thing is that while you do tend to see these two camps very at odds, the truth of the matter is that typically you want it somewhere in the middle, where you want to let people use your IP to, you know, create their own fan content as well. It's beneficial for the company, and it lets the people who enjoy the games basically create and enjoy more content of the game, and so it's something that is mostly positive. Obviously, you don't want to let people have this complete free reign. Like, you don't want people making things that could potentially come back to harm the company as well. Like, you don't want someone making like some kind of terrorist manifesto or something with your games like being the forefront of whatever they're trying to push as well. And in that kind of situation, I can see like the companies wanting to restrict it. But the issue at hand, and this is something that I experienced in real life talking to one of my bosses in a company that I worked in the past, which I shall not name, I actually brought up to him the whole like Toei issue that happened at the time, as I was talking to him casually about it like over lunch. And at the time, it's like, and this was something that I found with many of the other companies during that period as well, is that many of the people in the industry who are fairly on the older side and that are more traditional in terms of the work culture that they grew up in, they tend to be very against this type of fan-made content, or just like content that was not officially made by themselves in general, simply because they view all of these people who are producing this kind of content, like, it doesn't matter what kind of content it is. The fact of the matter is many of them do see content creators as leeches, which like, yeah, I really laughed at myself for the irony of the situation that I'm in talking about it right now. The fact of the matter is that many of these older companies do see things this way, and it's because of this that you get many of the fairly strange sorts of restrictions that have existed out there for the longest of time. Like for the game Lost Judgment, the reason why it wasn't on PC for the longest of times is just simply due to the fact that the company that manages the main voice actor man person, they didn't want his voice to be anywhere on the internet, which I think I spoke about in the previous video as well. Simply put, they didn't want him to voice a game that's on the PC because that would basically, according to them, mean that his voice is accessible on the internet, ignoring the fact that with consoles, you could still record it and put it on the internet. Fact of the matter is, you have people like this who basically cause the way that content actually is able to proliferate or spread in general to be very restrictive, because they basically force everything from stopping the game from being released in certain regions or certain platforms, and causing a rift between them and the people who enjoy their content, seeing them as either leeches or tools to be used. Now, needless to say, of course, not all companies are like this. Especially nowadays, the more recent and modern companies, you do tend to see that they tend to be a lot more positive with all of this. You see people like Yoko Taro basically going online and talking about how he really loves the fact that people are creating like doujin works or just like fan-made works of the games that he has created in the past. There are many, especially the more successful personalities within the space, who are just more receptive to fan-made content. But that said, these people still do tend to be the abnormally more so than the norm. And while newer developers are slowly starting to buck this trend, it is still a fact that this is still something that is very prevalent, and many companies out there are very, very ready and trigger happy in trying to shut off all forms of content that do not show their work in a positive light. And because of this, it tends to create a level of isolation between them and their fans. In that, because they are just shutting off entire channels of feedback that they could be receiving from their fans, or the opinions that they could be getting from people who enjoy their works, it results in many of these companies just simply not understanding what the general like gaming space, what the players want, and results in them making some very questionable decisions. One of the biggest examples recently is probably Sony as well, with what they did with the Ghost of Tsushima, as well as Helldivers 2 with the whole PSN thing. And when you look at the interview that the CEO gave, you can tell that he kind of is living in a fairly out of touch sort of reality that just doesn't seem very contrary to what is happening out there now. And he believes that if he releases the first game, or like releases it for a period on the PC first, and then releases the sequel, or just locks it off and then releases it purely only on console, that it will be enough of a driving factor to get people to go onto consoles. Also because of the fact that he feels like it's a very affordable alternative to the PC, which with the current pricings of the PS5 now and how cheaply you can actually get a fairly decent PC, it's not exactly as true anymore. And the fact that with the console, you're basically getting a more restrictive experience. And aside from this, and arguably what is likely to be the thing that is hurting the industry's ability to develop something new even more, is the fact that within Japan, there has always been a very high level of patenting within the game industry. And I really do mean this, like, it's something that you are starting to see more of from Korea as well as China, but it is something that has largely been very strong within Japan and that you don't really see as much in the West. Like, you look at all of the big AAA companies within Japan, most of them are basically pushing out, both filing and receiving about 100 plus patents every single year, with companies like Konami sometimes even getting to 200 in a single year. And we do see cases here and there of companies actually suing each other over what they believe are breaches of these systems that they are patenting within the games. For those of you who are wondering, they're not just patenting hardware, although there are cases like that, especially with Nintendo. You do see that for stuff like how the Switch can be used or how the DS can be used, they do patent that as well. But aside from that, there are many companies out there who are literally just patenting systems as well. Things like how you can basically set up a raising character system in a mobile game, how you basically get a character to awaken, like you get your SR to become a UR or whatever techno-babble jargon you guys want to use. All of that is being patented by many of these companies, although for those of you who wonder how it works, basically you can only really patent the very specific method of doing the thing. So like, for example, if you wanted a system where a 3-star character could awaken to 4-star and then to 5-star, you basically had to list down every single step down the process that you are trying to patent. And if the patent feels generally too vague, it will be quite likely to get rejected. You need to make these steps as specific as possible. For example, you might need to detail that you need to use specifically 4 copies of the 3-star, merge it with a base copy, and then it becomes a 4-star. And then you need to use 3 copies of a 4-star to become a 5-star and something like this. You need to make sure to be specific. But the issue there, even in the idea of specificity, is the fact that because there are so many companies out there who are basically pushing out so many patents, trying to basically reach and grab as many different segments of the industry as they can, it actually makes it very difficult to walk the fine line between your thing being fairly general and therefore acceptable, or accidentally straying to somebody's territory and being something that they can sue you for. And we do see a case like this happening now with the whole Konami versus Cygames thing with Uma Musume, which is still going on, in case you're wondering. Like, it even gets so bad that with many of the companies I've worked in the past, they actually have full-on legal departments, not just to deal with all of the weirdos who stick their dicks into consoles and get it jammed in there and are trying to get some kind of compensation from the company, but rather to look through all of the different patents that exist to ensure that whenever the developer wants to suggest something wholly new, whether or not it's actually safe for the company to use without getting sued. And also then whether the company themselves can patent the thing, at which point they would actually reward the employee that provided them with the new idea, which in and of itself makes the whole industry feel very restrictive. And it does feel like that's also part of the reason why you don't see very many massive indie companies out within Japan, in part due to the fact that with these companies, they also do not want to run the risk of potentially treading on all of this. And so for the most part, you do tend to see that while there are some, you don't really see as many as within the rest of the world. And then it might also then go on to explain why there are so many companies within Japan that basically serve as outsourced companies for the bigger companies, why there are so many companies whose entire business is just to produce games for the AAAs or the AAs or the publishers. And it might be simply due to the fact that it's easier for them to just produce what these companies who hold the patents want, and therefore the responsibility is on those companies rather than to try to develop something wholly new and suffer the risk of getting sued instead. I feel like with this, there isn't really too much I need to explain as to why this is bad. Like, yeah, I can kind of get the idea of wanting to protect the technology you introduce or thought up, and therefore the thing that you want to ensure that people can't just like nick, like you don't want your Switch to just be like reverse engineered and sold as the bitch or something by another company. But at the same time, when it comes to all of the systems especially, it does feel like it reduces the industry's ability to be innovative, simply because they just don't want to go through with all of the additional costs and the potential risk of treading on one of the thousands of patents that exist out there. That might potentially get the company in trouble as well. And lastly is the fact that with Japan, you do have a country where there has for the longest of time been a language divide, and in a sense, some level of cultural isolation has resulted from that as well. Like many of the countries within Asia, Japan is one of those countries that has a largely local indigenous population. Some have also said for the longest of times the country has been fairly isolationist, and to some extent that has been the case, in part due to the fact that after the huge economic miracle the country went through many years before, and even after the bubble burst and the country has been in a level of not too good for quite a while now, there has always been this belief that Japan can sustain itself, and this has been something that, funnily enough, my fairly traditional boss who believes that like any form of content creator who uses like the IP of the company is a leech. Funnily enough, that guy actually believes as well simultaneously that Japan has always, like from his own experience as well, been a country that has lived in the lie of self-reliance for too long. And because of the fact that many people buy into the belief that the country can sustain itself, there has never really been a push for people within Japan to have the motivation to want to learn a foreign language, like English, for example, so that they can interact better with the rest of the world. But yeah, so for the longest of time, it has been more the anomaly for people within Japan to actually enjoy content coming from the rest of the world. Even the people I know who did enjoy it, like I knew people who were very into like metal as well. Like they really love bands like Sonata Arctica and Sabaton. Couldn't understand a word of what the band was singing, but the music still resonated with them. Like, those people tended to be quite the anomaly, and even these people who did enjoy foreign content, many of them don't actually have the ability to enjoy it fully because they can't understand the language that it is in. Like even now at work, some of the people I talk to about like indie games and like upcoming games, there's always that divide of, because I can read English, I think. I am speaking English now, right? I'm not going crazy, am I? But yeah, there has always been that divide of I can play games that they simply are not able to, especially when it comes to strategy and city builder games, because the language is just that big of a barrier for them. And these are still people who are in their 20s as well, and people who actually enjoy foreign games. Like one of them actually plays League of Legends. Lord have mercy on his soul. And even those people tend to have difficulties with this language barrier. And as a result, there are many things about the game industry that they're just simply not able to understand or like appreciate as well, because there has been that divide that has kept this content away from them as well. Now, granted, nowadays you're starting to see the bucking of this trend as well, as more and more people start to feel some level of motivation to learn English within Japan as well. In part, or maybe like a large part, thanks to the power of VTubers as well. Yeah, especially like the American or like just the English Hololive, especially the Naked Shark. I feel like many people within Japan really do like her a lot. And it's because of these VTubers and the types of games they play and the type of content that they show on their streams as well, that it has pushed many people within Japan to want to try to pick up the language so they can also understand what happens in the streams. You would think it would have happened earlier with people wanting to play some of the classic games that existed, but apparently this is the thing that has caused them to want to do it instead, which is fine. I just wish it happened earlier, to be honest. But yeah, what this also means is that for the longest of times, there has been this fairly big part of the industry that has been left untouched by influences from the rest of the world. So okay, this might be a little bit of a contentious point, but so some people have, for the longest of time, argued that when it comes to content creator in Japan, they would prefer that it remain untouched by Western influences, especially with the recent rise in all of the talk about stuff about how people are trying to like whitewash parts of the anime culture by translating it in ways that many people are unhappy with, and how this is also sliding into games due to many of the companies that have begun to some extent to buy more into the idea of like DEI and all of that. Look, I'm not someone who understands the whole concept of all of that enough to make a judgment on whether or not it's good or bad, alright? Like I've just lived in like Japan, working here for the longest of time. Yeah, I know English, yeah, I can kind of understand what is going on in the rest of the world, but at the same time, there has never been as much of a drive or incentive for me to like look into all of that to the level perhaps to as compared to people who live in regions that are more affected by all of this. I feel like that said, the entire view of all of this, like the both camps are a little extreme in a way. Like the idea that Japanese content has for the longest of times been untouched and allowed to grow on its own is kinda not true as well. Like when you look at many of the famous works that exist out there, many of them have been affected or like influenced, inspired to some extent by things that came from the West, right? You look at something like Evangelion, there's a lot of talk about Christianity in there. The ending song for the anime was an English song, and there was also a lot of usage of the ideas purported by some of the early psychologists. Like I'm probably gonna end up butchering their names, right? Sigmund Freud and Lacanian. But yeah, even aside from that, you can look at stuff like Wizardry, right? A game made by a company in North America somewhere. I'm not sure it's the US or Canada, but they made Wizardry. And that's a game that ended up inspiring many of the, or most of the initial JRPG genre in Japan, right? Games such as Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, most of them were initially inspired by Wizardry in the first place. And frankly, I feel like this is nothing that any dev should be ashamed of, right? Everybody, especially in this day and age where there's so many people out in the world and game development has become as accessible as it is, that creating something that's wholly, completely original is tough. And many people are, especially because of the fact that you have a medium with so much content that exists to this day, are to some extent influenced or inspired by something or another, or maybe many things in fact, when they go about creating systems or entire games as well. Right, the creator of Stellar Blade also attributes his inspirations to games like Nier Automata and Sekiro. Fact of the matter is, it's not just Japan that is influenced by all of these other countries, but also all these other countries have, to some extent, provided influences to Japanese companies as well. I feel like I went around that the completely wrong way. No, yeah, the rest, just as how the rest of the world has influenced Japan, Japan has influenced the rest of the world. And you can see this from many other companies as well, with Koei Tecmo and how the Three Kingdoms from China became such a big thing in pushing what the company initially became. Like the Atelier series from Gast as well, that's another thing, right? Where it's based off alchemy. That's not an originally Japanese idea as well. There's many of this, and we do tend to see that many of the big successful titles within Japan are titles that are produced by people who arguably are more in tune with content created in the rest of the world than many of the average people within Japan. And this is something that's also important to remember, which is that more the producers of many of these titles are people who get quite a lot of influence or inspiration from content created overseas as well. These people are, I'm going to end up saying the thing again, and I don't want to say it again, but you get what I mean. There are many more people who just don't get access to such content and who aren't exposed to it as much, who might also have ended up working under these people as well, and are the ones who are responsible for the day-to-day creation of new ideas as well as like systems and specs within the game. You know, maybe it's a good thing that Japanese games didn't take too much inspiration from these games, to be honest, because this was actually the first battle I had actually in the game, and like, yeah, that did not go well at all. And as a result, there are many people within the industry in Japan that just do not know about the huge variety of games that exist across the world. And it's not just in the idea of like, they don't see the things that influence the decision making at corporate level to do something because it's good for the metrics. I'm talking about like, I had to, a few months back, explain to my boss, as well as the people in my team, like what a roguelike game is. Like, these were people who have never played games like Slay the Spire, RimWorld. I mean, I know the second one's not exactly roguelike, but this is just go with the flow here. Darkest Dungeons. Like, some of these very big games at the indie level that arguably have become fairly iconic for their generation, all just, no, they didn't know what it was. I had to explain to them what a roguelike is because For them, the concept of what a roguelike is basically a RPG game with a randomized dungeon, which arguably is more of a roguelite than a roguelike. But the whole concept of games like this are something that many of them just don't even take into account because it is just that rare within the country, and they just don't get as much exposure to games that come from the rest of the world. And I feel like this is a double-edged sword. Like, yes, it's important for Japan to have its own unique vision and not get too overwhelmed into the whole general like trend of what is considered the in thing to do as well, in terms of like what draws in people to your games and the like. Like, you want them to have that unique style of content creation that has made it popular over the years, and for them to continue doing that as well. For sure, I very do much agree with that, because like the culture here, the way the people have been raised, it creates a very different perspective that obviously it makes people create stuff that many people in other parts of the world find interesting because it's so refreshing, because you have this group of people with a very different way of thinking that have largely been fairly insular, and as a result continue to create content that is fairly different from what you see in many parts of the world that are more intertwined, and where everybody knows and follows what the general global popular trends are. But at the same time, it also means that it's gonna take longer for the Japanese game industry to develop on its own, because of the fact that they're gonna basically go through slowly all of the processes that other parts of the world, because of the fact that the world is so like intertwined as is, have already experienced. And it's gonna take them longer to understand what works and what doesn't. Right? They might spend time trying to figure out entire systems or ways to work with like certain themes or styles of genres within a game, only for us to then realize when the game like actually reaches us that, bruh, this is like exactly like something that an indie company somewhere in hell Norway has made like 7 or 8 years ago. Like, that is a very real possibility. That's simply because they're not able to absorb much of what is being released out in the world, that they may not know what already exists, and therefore they would then go through the process of realizing those things exist and innovating into things that already exist, and that in a way could slow down the levels of innovation within the country. And in a way, the language barrier and the cultural clash that exists between what like companies in America like Visa, MasterCard have been trying to push recently are compared to what is considered the norm in Japan. Like, a large part of that and all of the outcry that has existed over the years with people being unhappy with the style of content that comes out of Japan does also, especially when you consider the fact that the people in Japan, many of them don't really speak English very well. They don't really have the ability to look through all of the information that exists out there and realize that just as there are that small minority of people who go ballistic over everything they create, there's also a fairly big number of people who do enjoy what they create and want them to create it more and even release it in English. They don't have the ability to get access to all of that information, and on top of that, the clash in cultures can sometimes also cause them to just withdraw back instead, simply because due to the lack of ability to interact with the situation at hand and seeing all of the backlash that the content they create gets, they just choose not to release their games overseas instead. And I feel like this is also part of why you still see so many companies that either have delayed releases for their games globally, especially with mobile games, or they just don't release it overseas at all, like 90% of the Idolmaster games that exist. Like, I've actually worked in teams in the past that actually told me that they really just didn't feel like there was a market for their games outside of Japan, because they just look at like the stuff that comes out of America, like your Gears of War and your original Baldur's Gate with a very buff man, and they were just like, yeah, maybe there just isn't a market for our very moe kawaii girls and our femboys like Cloud. Maybe all of that just doesn't appeal to people, and so let's just not release it. And like, while the big companies do realize that there is a market, there are many companies that tend to be on the smaller side. They just feel like there isn't much of a market for them to attract with all of this. And this is especially so when it comes to mobile games, where you do see many titles that just do not bother at all. Like most of the Idolmaster games, once again, Konami's Power Pro series, Heaven Burns Red as well. It does feel like a lot of this is just the belief that the games would not do well outside of Japan due to the style of the game, and also due to the difference in the levels of spending propensity of people within the West as compared to the East, that results in this very defeatist mentality where they just decide that, yeah, our game isn't gonna do as well in America and in the Europe in general because people don't spend as much. Let's just not bother, which sounds very silly since like it doesn't cost as much to localize a already existing game. Even if it's like slightly delayed, most people do seem to prefer that instead, in part because they can prep for the banners, which might be why these companies don't want to do it as well, due to the fact that a delayed release would basically earn them less, and that might have driven them away from the desire to produce such titles as well, and it just results in them giving up overall. So yeah, I do feel like there is a need for some level of balance. Like, there is a need for companies within Japan to receive like this some level of inspiration as well as influences from the rest of the world. But there's this need to understand what exists out there while also not compromising on their values that I feel needs to be something that these companies need to focus on to some extent, so that they can basically allow themselves to expand their horizons and therefore become more innovative while not losing what gives them an edge as well. Then and also get rid of patents. Like, this whole idea of patents in the game industry for systems fucking sucks and just should not exist, to be honest. But yeah, this is how I feel like all of the characteristics of the Japanese game industry come back to influence it and the way that it actually operates, and how I feel like they both make it unique as well as at times impede the industry. Needless to say, we went over what feels like more points that were negative rather than positive, but I do feel like, especially after working in it for quite a few years now, like that there are many things that the industry in Japan simply is just lagging behind in, and that really needs to improve, especially now where you're starting to see more and more of the AAA companies slowly starting to shutter some of their smaller studios and fire staff simply because they've reached the point where they are no longer able to pull in the level of success and growth that they need. But at the same time, we do see that the indie scene here just simply isn't as vibrant. And I feel like all of that really needs to change if we want to see Japan continue to be like a big player in the game industry going forward. Usually it feels like this is the point of the video where people will put in the call to action telling you like what to do or like what needs to be done and all of that. The only thing is that I do feel like there isn't really as much for me to put over here, if anything, due to the fact that it really does feel like this is one of those situations where most of the people, you guys watching the video, you probably aren't planning to enter the game industry, or even if you do, the odds that you want to work specifically in the Japanese game industry is quite unlikely, especially since the exchange rate now is so I can understand that like it's probably something where like even if I were to say all this, it's not like it's gonna cause anything to change. Maybe. But hopefully, for those of you who still intend to work in the Japanese game industry, who still do see that as a goal to work towards, and who may one day actually end up working in Japan as well as a result of all of that, I want you guys to remember, hopefully, what I talked about in this video as well. Some of the things that are causing issues in it, and if you do see it happening still in the industry, then maybe at the time, you know, using the power of what I like to call the foreigner card, you can hopefully, like to some extent, try to push for some level of change through your own little ways, and maybe one day we might see the industry get better than it is today. There are people, like even Japanese people in the industry, especially those who came from indie backgrounds, who are very keenly aware of the issues with the industry as well. But the issue is, those people are still the minority, and the many more people do still see what is happening today as the norm. And so while things might slowly begin to change as more talented young people hopefully begin to come up and into the industry, it's also true that, and I do hope that if you guys ever get the chance to work with or in the industry, that you try to get people to contribute of their own will, maybe give them some incentive to do so, stuff like that. Pay them fairly if you're like paying them, try to work with them in a way to get them to understand how everything else works outside of the space that they live in. I feel like a lot of the giving them of different perspectives is also very important. So yeah, if you guys ever get the chance to, I guess that's the most I can put for a call to action. If the hypothetical chance ever comes, do your best to try and help with this situation, and maybe one day we might see the industry grow to be the good thing that many of us older people remember from the past. But that said, thank you all for watching this video. I feel like it has probably been very long. Right now, I have just recorded the video, so I don't know how long it is yet, but I have already edited like a small fraction of it, and it does seem like it's going to be fairly long. So I hope this video was informative and it was entertaining for you guys as well. It certainly was a very long one to record, so if you watched to this point, like, thank you so much for actually sticking with it till the end. That said, this is not the end of the series itself just yet. There are still more things that I want to talk about in the future. One of which might be perhaps part 3, depending how things go. Whether or not Japan is slowly starting to lose out to the other countries in Asia, such as Korea and China, in terms of game development. I feel like that would make for a very interesting topic as well. And it's something that I feel like it's important to talk about, as these are countries that are starting to rapidly improve, and it does feel like that they are starting to catch up, if not overtaking Japan in certain ways as well. But that said, this is the end of this video. Thank you so much for watching once again, and thank you to the following people for supporting the channel through all of the ways that you do, and to everyone else of you as well. I feel like that's not proper English, but to all of you as well who watched this video till the end, and who watch all of my other videos as well, do feel free to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. And if you want to see more of this, or perhaps some of the other stuff I do talk about console games, and sometimes just once in a while current event stuff for the game industry, and also a lot of like event side stuff for anime stuff if you're interested in all of that. I do have a Patreon as well as PayPal. You can feel free to support the channel there if you want, to help support me making more videos like this. And we also have a Discord set up by this really cool fella, where you can see the schedules for when I sometimes stream, as well as for when the rest of the videos that I like are within the next like 1 month or 2 span, what I'm planning to do over there as well. And so if you wanna say hi or just shit post, feel free to join as well. But that said, I'll be heading off for now. Until the next time when we meet, or until part 3 of the series, take care and bye-bye.